I made my first iOS app in 2008 when there was one single screen size to worry about, and laying out an app was just defining some XY coordinates and a width and a height. But now, an iPhone app can run on literally any screen size. In this video, I'm going to introduce how to use auto layout, which is Apple's technology for UIKit to help you lay out your UI elements for multiple screen sizes and orientations. So I've got a brand new app here, and I'm going to go into the storyboard and drag a label onto the screen. So there we go, speaking moistly, look it up. And what I want to do is have this label appear in the center of the screen. And right now I've dragged it into the center of this screen, which is an iPhone 11 screen. So if I run this on an iPhone 11, it's going to appear in the center as I want it to. But if I look at this on an iPhone SE, it will actually appear closer to the bottom right, because the XY position is exactly the same in both cases, but for this screen size, it pushes it way down into the right corner rather than being centered. And if I go back to the iPhone 11 screen and then just go to a horizontal orientation, the label's completely shifted off of the device altogether, because again, it's based on the XY position and not on the fact that I want it in the center of the screen. So this problem and many other types of problems can be solved by using a technology called auto layout, where instead of defining the position within the coordinate system, we define where our elements should be using relationships. So I don't really care what the X and Y position of this label is. What I want to say is that this label should appear in the center of its parent view, which in this case happens to be the screen. So I need a way of defining that relationship, just center this within its parent. So when we're using auto layout, we create these things called constraints. And there's many ways of doing that in a storyboard file. One of the easiest ways is to just right click and drag from one of the views to the other view. So I want my label to be in the center of its super view, so I'm going to right click, drag from the label to its super view. And then I get a few different options here for constraints that I can create between these two views. And I'm going to ignore most of these for now. I'm just concerned with the center constraints right here. So I can say center horizontally in safe area, and then right click, drag again, and center vertically in safe area. And that defines the relationship. And this has caused a warning here. And this is a really common thing in auto layout, that you'll create a constraint that doesn't quite seem right to Xcode, so you get a little warning. Right now, I've said I want it to be centered horizontally and vertically, but when I had the label dragged onto the screen, it must not have been centered properly. So if you go into the top left corner here and click on the orange circle arrow button here, you will actually be able to get Xcode to fix this for you. So I can say, yeah, my constraints are right, just update the frames for me. So now I've got my label, it's centered, and those constraints you can see are going to constrain it to the center of its super view. And if I view these devices again, so I'm going to view this in an SE size, it's now actually centered in the screen. And if I even go to a landscape or back to 11 landscape, it's always going to be centered. And by the way, these devices at the bottom here allow you to view what it might look like on these different screen sizes. So this can be really handy when you're laying out your views in storyboards. And just for completeness, I've run this in the simulator, and here's what it looks like. And if I rotate the view here, it's perfectly centered. Now, when we created those constraints, those are objects that have been created that we can see in Interface Builder. So if I select the label and go over to the size inspector here, I can actually see these constraints at the bottom here, and I could click on them and edit them if I wanted to. And I can also see them in the left panel over here as well. So if you ever need to modify or delete a constraint, you can select them in these different ways. Now, I've got the label, it's centered. I want to add another view now, and I'm just going to add a normal UI view that I want to sit underneath the label that will act as kind of a bold underline for this label. So I'm going to start by dragging this view onto the screen and just kind of laying it out without any constraints just to see what it's going to look like. So I'm going to set the color to be a nice pink, and I think something like that, yeah. So thinking in terms of relationships here, I want this view to always sit maybe 10 points below the label and be, I think, roughly twice the width of the label and always be centered with the label. So those are the relationships I'm going for. So I don't love the right-clicking and dragging method. I find that it doesn't always work for me. So I prefer instead to use these buttons at the bottom here. So if I select both of these views that I want to create a constraint between, I can then select one of these buttons at the bottom. So this button right here is an alignment button. So if I want to align two views together, I can select this, and I'm going to select the horizontal centers. So this will create a constraint that aligns their centers horizontally, which is exactly what I want in this case. So I'm going to add that one constraint. I've just added one constraint now, and you can kind of see there's a little bit of a red line, but also up at the top left here, there's a red arrow now. Before it was orange, now it's red. And red means warning, like there's an error, something is really wrong in this case. And it's saying that it needs constraints for more things. So it needs constraints for Y position, height. Needs constraints for X position or width. So the reason this warning is coming up is because when we start to use auto layout on a view, we have to give enough constraints so that the view knows how to set its X position, its Y position, its width, and its height. So the moment that we start using constraints, we need to make sure that we set enough constraints to calculate all of those values. And with the label, we were fine just setting an X and Y position because a label can actually figure out its own size based on the text within the label. This is called an intrinsic content size, and labels and image views and buttons, because they use labels and image views, they can all determine their own width and height based on the content within them. And this is a really good thing, because if the user changes the default font size and our labels change size because of that, then the rest of our content should just adjust to that automatically. But in this case, just the normal UI view here, I have to make sure I set enough constraints so that it knows exactly how to draw itself. So right now I've got its X position set, but I'm going to need one for its Y position, its width, and its height. So for its Y position, I want it to be always just 10 points below the label. So this time I'm just going to select the bottom view, and I'm going to go down to this little square TIE Fighter looking button here, and I'm going to select this top constraint. And these four right here represent the top, left, bottom, and right constraints. I only want to set the top constraint here. So I want to set it to be 10 points away from the closest thing to the top of it. So just by selecting this, I can add that one constraint and it will add that for me. It will now make sure it's 10 points away from the label. But now I still need a width and a height. So for the width, I want it to be 2 times the width of the label here. So I can select both of these views and again select that square TIE Fighter thing. And I'm going to go for equal widths because I want it to be equal to the width of the label but times 2. So I can select that. And it actually made them equal. It updated the frame for me. So that's not exactly what I wanted, but it's kind of almost there. So what I need to do is select the constraint from over here. So I'll drag this out so I can see them a little better. And this is the constraint I just created that's saying that the width should be equal. With that selected, I can go over to the inspector panel here, and I can change some of the values. So one of these values is the multiplier, and if I change that from a 1 to a 2, it's now going to be double the width of the label. And now that I see that, I think that might be a little bit too wide, so maybe I'm going to go for a 1.5, and I actually prefer that value. So now the pink view is always going to be 1.5 times the size of the label. Notice that we've still got the red arrow up here. That's because we haven't yet defined any constraints for the height of the view, and we need constraints for all of those values. So for the height, it's not really a relationship to another view. I just want this height to always be 10 points. So what I'm going to do is go down to this button again and click it, and I can just set this height to be a constant value. So I'm going to make sure it's 10, so it's always going to be that 10 height. And now that I have a constraint for X, Y, width, and height, that warning's gone away and the frames have updated, and this is essentially what it's going to look like when I run the app. So if I run this again, here it is on the iPhone 11, it's already been rotated, and that's what it looks like, and it's perfectly centered with that pink view directly underneath that label. Okay, so I'm just going to add one more button here. I'm going to drag this to the top right, and I'm going to set this to be a settings button. So I'll delete the label, and I'm going to set this image to be a gear icon. And then I'm going to drag this into the top right of the screen. And as I do, you'll see these kind of guides pop up that are kind of allowing me to put that into a convenient location on the screen. So I'm going to drop it in there and then select that square TIE Fighter button to now place it into the top right of the screen. So if I select the top and the right, the relationship here is I want it to always stick to the top right of the iPhone screen. The top says 0 and the right says 20. And I can see that the top is not actually 0 points away from the top of the screen. It's more like 20, 30, maybe 40 points away from the top of the screen. But this says 0. If we select this button and go over to the size inspector, we can select the constraint there. And we can see that it's constraining the top of the button equal to the top of the safe area. And if I hover over that safe area, it's actually getting highlighted on the device screen there. And the safe area isn't actually a view. It's just a guide that is created so that we can easily constrain our elements to the part of the screen that the user won't accidentally hit. Because if we put a button underneath this bar down here, the user might accidentally tap it when they're going to do something else. So we get these safe area guides that you'll most of the time constrain your items to. Now, if you had like an image or like a full-size video or something, you'd want to constrain your items all the way to the edges of the device. But most of the time with your standard user interfaces, you're going to want to constrain them to the safe areas. So this is how I might create some constraints in a storyboard. But let's take a look at how I might create an element in code and constrain it in Swift. Okay, so I have a button here, it's connected to an action, and it's added to the subview. And I now need to define its layout using auto layout constraints. So what I want to do is create a button that just takes up the entire width of the device size, but just sits at the very, very bottom of the screen. So I'm going to constrain the left side of the button to the left side of the screen, the right side of the button to the right side of the screen, and the bottom to the bottom. So over the years, there have been a few different ways of creating constraints in code. Currently, the most modern standard way from Apple is to use things called anchors. So every view will have an anchor for the different ways they can be constrained. So if I want to constrain the left side of the button, there'll be a left anchor. And then what you do is create a constraint from that anchor. So I'll call the constraint method. And there's a bunch of different constraint methods. In this case, I just want it to be equal to another view's anchor. So I can just call the equal to method and specify the superview's left anchor. So that creates a constraint, but it's a two-step process. You need to create the constraint and you need to activate the constraint because the constraints get created in an inactive state. So I can create a new variable here and then just set is active to true. So I've now created one constraint and activated it, but I now need to do that for the other two constraints. So I now have my three constraints created and they're activated, but there's one more thing you have to do when you're creating constraints from Swift. You have to actually tell the view, in this case the button, that you're going to be using constraints rather than using CGRex. And you do that with a property called translates auto resizing masks into constraint, and you have to set that to false. So you've got to create the view, you've got to set that property to false, you've got to add it as a subview, and then you've got to create all of the constraints that are needed in order to set its X, Y, width, and height. But now that's all done, we should be able to see a push me button at the very bottom of the screen. And there is the push me button. It's at the very bottom of the screen. And I'm actually going to flip this back to portrait so we can see this a little better. But yeah, there's the button. It's taking up the width of the device, and I can push that button, but it's at the very bottom. So with this button, it got constrained to the safe area, so we can actually see it and push it correctly, and it's not underneath these icons. But here, the button isn't constrained to the safe area, it's constrained to the bottom, so it's actually at the very bottom of the screen. And this is a big issue for the user experience of this application. So we need to make sure that with a button like this, we're constraining it to the safe area. And to do that, it's really easy. Just instead of constraining this equal to the super view's bottom anchor, the view here has a property called safe area layout guide, which is the UI layout guide, and those have their own anchors. So we have this layout guide, we're going to use that anchor instead, and now it should sit above that bottom button there, and this is considered the safe area for UI controls and other elements. There's also one other thing we want to consider. Here I'm using the left and right anchors, which makes sense technically, but a lot of the time we don't want to think in terms of left and right. We want to think in terms of leading and trailing. And this is because of internationalization. So if we have a bunch of elements that in an English language need to be on the left and another bunch of elements that need to be on the right, like maybe we have text on the left and image on the right, when we flip that to a language that reads from right to left, then we want to flip those elements around too. So if we're using things like left and right, we're always going to hard code our elements to the left and right side of the screen. But if we use leading and trailing, then those elements are more dynamic and can be flipped when it suits the language a little bit better. So in this case, it's not really going to make a difference, but it's just a good habit to get into, that instead of using left and right, unless you really need it to be left and right, use leading anchor and trailing anchor. So this is working and I've set up the constraints correctly, but a lot of the time, especially in the beginning, you're going to set up constraints that conflict with each other. And auto layout doesn't know what to do when you set up conflicting constraints. So for example, here I'm saying that the button's edges should be the same as the view's edges. But what if I also set a width? What if I set a width of the button that was like 100 points? Then it wouldn't know what to do. Would it be 100 points or would it be constrained to the edges of the view? So let's see what happens when we try and do something like that. So I'm creating a constraint equal to a constant and I'm just activating it immediately. And we get this really long, nasty looking error message. And this is the error message you get every time you have a constraint that conflicts with another constraint. So if you have many conflicting constraints, you're just going to have logs and logs that look like this. And they're not actually that bad to read, much better than some other error logs. We can see right here in plain English, it says, will attempt to recover by breaking constraint button push me dot width equals 100. So that's not actually bad. That tells me actually pretty well that the push me button has a constraint that's trying to set the width to be 100, and that's the one that's not getting used. And if I look at the app, yeah, I can see it looks like maybe it's not 100. It looks like maybe it's like centered perfectly because it's taking up the width of the screen. So these error messages aren't too bad, and you should try and read through them and make sense of them because they will tell you what went wrong and what auto layout tried to do to fix it. Because that's the important thing. You need to know what the system did in order to try and fix the problem, because a lot of the time it's not going to be the correct thing. But one thing we can do to make this even better is to attach readable identifiers to each of the constraints. So in this case, I've taken the constraint, put it into a variable now, attached an identifier that is this string, bottom button width with a smiley face, and still activated it. So now when I get this error log, it actually tells me that identifier. So that makes it even a little bit easier to read these error messages as well. But my biggest suggestion is just read through them because they will tell you exactly what's gone wrong. So I'm going to delete that constraint. Right now I have this label and view in the center of the screen, which is great. But let's say there's a time in my app where I actually want to push that to the very top of the screen. Like maybe at the beginning of the app, I want to have it in the middle, but then I need to make room for some other content, so I'm going to push it up to the top and maybe I'll animate that change or something. But one important rule of using constraints is that if you're using auto layout constraints on a view, you should not change its size or position using CG-rect or CG-point. So if I can't change the frame of these views to push them up to the top, how do I change the position and layout of these views? And that is modifying a constraint at runtime. So we need a way of accessing that auto layout constraint, the one that's putting it in the center of the screen, and modifying it so that they appear at the top of the screen. And we'll do that when we push the button. So when we push the button, we'll push it to the top of the screen. So back in the storyboard, I'm going to select the label because it's the constraint on the label that's pinning it to the middle of the screen. And it's this constraint right here. So I need to be able to access this from my code at runtime. And to do that, this should be very familiar. You just right click and drag and set it as a property in the view controller. So I'm going to call this label center constraint. And I get a nice IB outlet to this NS layout constraint. And that's the object, it's the NS layout constraint. So now at runtime, I can change this constraint. And before we do that, we can take a look at how we might change a constraint. So over in the size inspector here, I have the constraint selected, and there's a few different options, a few different things I can change. I can change the identifier, which won't change the layout. I can change the multiplier, which might be helpful. But there's this constant property too, that despite its name can actually be changed. So if I change this constant, let's just say I change it from 0 to 200, you can see the view jumped down by 200 points. So if I wanted to go the other way, I could set this to minus 200 and it would jump up. So I can change the constant property of a constraint and it will change what that constraint does. So in this case, maybe I could just change that constant from 0 at runtime and push it up to the top of the screen. So let's try that. So from the view controller, when the button is pushed, I'm going to take this constraint and I'm going to set its constant to be, well, it's going to be a negative value because it's going up. So maybe I'll set it minus view.height divided by 2 because it's going to be half that. But then we want it pushed down a bit because of the safe area. So I don't really want to do any math, so I'm just going to throw in a random number. I'm just going to say plus 100 because then that'll push it down a bit. And it's actually view.frame.size.height. So let's just see if that works. So there's the app, and I push the button, and yeah, that actually kind of worked. And if I rotate the screen, works when I push the button anyway. When we rotate it, it's in a different location. I have to re-push the button, but it kind of works. So this constraint isn't great. I have to do math, which I've done wrong here, to actually get it to work. But also, when the screen size changes, I have to re-push the button to make it work. So this center constraint maybe shouldn't be modified this way. It might be a little bit too difficult. And in these cases, it might be nicer to, instead of modifying the constraint, to actually use two different constraints and activate or deactivate one depending on what you want the outcome to be. So I'll show you an example of that. If we go back to the storyboard, we have this label and it's constrained to the center. But at some point in the future, I want it to be constrained to the top. And I can use a completely different constraint to do this. So if I take the label and I click this button and click the top, and I'm going to say 0. I just want it to be constrained to the safe area at the very top. And if I add this one constraint, well, it adds a conflicting constraint, which doesn't give me a warning. It just throws my layout off completely. But that's fine. We'll fix it. So I need to now select that constraint. There it is. And over here in the inspector, I can see that there's a checkbox that says installed. And this determines whether the constraint is actually active or inactive when the app gets built. So if I uncheck this box, my layout goes back to normal because the constraint exists, but it's not currently being used. So I have a constraint that constrains the label to the center of the view, and I have a constraint that constrains the label to the top of the view. And these are constricting constraints. They cannot exist together. And what I mean by that is that they can't be active together. They can both exist at the same time, but if one is inactive and the other one is active, then we're fine. So as long as we never activate them at the same time, we'll never get a conflict. So right now I have a reference to the center one, and this is the one that's active. If I create a reference now to this new constraint that's inactive, I'll be able to change which one is active when I need it to be active. So I'm going to right click and drag, and I'm going to name this one label top constraint. And then back in the code, instead of trying to figure out all of this stuff, what I'm going to do is set the center one to be inactive and set the top one to be active. And that's much easier to reason about, much easier to create and lay out. So now I'm going to re-rotate this around. I just prefer doing things in portrait. So right now, center is active and the top one is inactive. If I push this button, they flip. So the center one becomes inactive and the top one becomes active. And if I keep pushing this button, nothing else happens. But There we have two conflicting constraints that we can use to create this custom behavior at runtime, which is great. And I'm going to take this one step further. I'm going to toggle the constraints. So now if I push the button and it's in the center, it will go to the top, and if it's at the top, it will go to the center. So there we go. And I'm not using frame or bounds or center or any of that stuff. I'm just creating relationships and telling the device which relationship I want it to be a part of. So this can be a really handy technique when you're using auto layout but need to move views at runtime in your application. It might take a little bit of practice to get used to, but it's a very, very powerful tool to have. So there's just one more thing I want to show you now. So let's say maybe we have like a few of these system buttons. I'm just going to copy the settings one for now. I don't know, maybe we have 4 of them and they all need to sit at the top of the screen and they all need to be spaced out evenly. So I could create a constraint for this button over here, and then I could figure out how to create a constraint here with an equal width here and then another one here. But then if I add another button in, then I'm going to have to update the constraints a little bit. And that's actually a pretty simple layout. The layouts can get way more complex than that. So there's another thing that we can use when we're laying out elements this way, and it's called a stack view. So if I select all the elements and come down to this very bottom right button here, I can ask Xcode to embed this into a stack view. And when it embeds it into a stack view, it creates a container that will hold all of these views. And all we have to do is constrain the container. So I'm going to say I want this stack view to be pinned to the top, right and left of the view. And then within this, any view that I put within this container, I can set rules for. So I can set how they should be distributed. I can set how they should be aligned if they were different sizes. And I can even change this from horizontal to vertical if I want to. So this can be a really handy tool because now, let's say, right, so I have the stack view over here. Let's say I need 8 buttons now. So all of these get duplicated. It's changed the spacing to 0 rather than it being hard-coded. But yeah, now the stack view just handles that, and again, I can start deleting these, and the stack view is just going to handle the layout for this. And if you're familiar with Flexbox in the browser, it's a little bit similar to that, but a little bit less powerful than that. But this can be a very handy tool when you don't want to program a whole bunch of constraints and you want this kind of behavior. And you can also just grab a stack view from this panel as well and dump it into the view, and you can put a stack view within a stack view, so I could have a vertical stack view here and then I could lay out items in that if I wanted to. So here's just another tool to help you lay out your different UI elements. That's it for my basic introduction to auto layout. There are more advanced topics that I might go over in another video, but for now, this is all the information you need to start laying out your UI elements effectively in your iOS apps. It might take a little bit of time before all of these tools feel natural to you, but just keep practicing and stay tuned for more videos on iOS.